In 1628, Dr. William Harvey wrote a short pamphlet describing the human body's circulatory system. Many believe it's the most important medical text ever written. Until Harvey, doctors believed blood was manufactured by the liver, moving back and forth through the body like the tides of an ocean.
The reason people wear wedding rings on this finger is it was thought in the old days that there was a special vein that went all the way from there right directly to the heart. Harvey made it clear that all the veins go back to the heart, not just that one from the finger.
William Harvey discovered that blood constantly circulates through the body, pumped by the heart. His explanation of the heart and circulatory system was revolutionary, the bedrock on which modern physiology, the study of how our body functions, is built. It was America's bloodiest chapter, the war that almost ripped apart a nation. This man bridged America's great divide and made it one nation, indivisible. Number 23 on our list, Abraham Lincoln.
Lincoln's prevailing thought was one of, no, we are not going to allow this nation called the United States of America to divide itself, to diminish the greatness and the potential of what this land could be.
His life is the great American story. A poor boy from the backwoods of Kentucky, with only a year's formal schooling, Lincoln taught himself the law. He became one of the most successful attorneys in Illinois and eventually president. But just a month after his inauguration in 1861, the South seceded from the Union and the Civil War began. For 4 bitter years, Lincoln would guide his country.
If you stop and think what would have happened if the South had prevailed, I mean, let's face it, they would have seceded from the Union. We would have had 2 countries, North and the South. They would have been at each other's throats forever. And it would have certainly doomed the United States of America.
The North wouldn't have won the Civil War if a lesser man had been president. A lesser man might have said, go ahead, create another country, we'll let you go. What Lincoln managed to do was to understand that the United States represented a larger idea.
Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves, but it would be 2 more years before the Confederacy finally surrendered at Appomattox, Virginia in April of 1865. Less than a week later, Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater in Washington.
With Abraham Lincoln, his legacy is not simply that he won the Civil War. It's that he left behind a body of writing like the Gettysburg Address and the Second Inaugural Address, which embodied American principles forever.
To this day, his speeches resonate, and it's no wonder. Lincoln used to drive his aides crazy rehearsing every word aloud. His Gettysburg Address remains one of the best-known 3 minutes in American history. The lines still touch us, and so do the ideals. That government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Lincoln's greatest legacy is the preservation of the Union and the creation of the modern notion of American life. The blacks were going to be included. We're going to be one nation, and slavery is unacceptable on the American continent.
He changed the world with a simple equation. Water plus heat equals steam. Number 25 on our list, Scottish inventor James Watt.
It doesn't surprise me at all that Watt is there. What's unfortunate is how few people even ever think of it.
You may have never heard of him, but this man is the godfather of the Industrial Revolution. Watt invented the first practical steam engine. He turned hot air into power, cheap power, and set off an explosion of manufacturing and business. Before steam, everything had been powered by people or animals, wind or water. The world moved at a leisurely pace. But steam set the machines running, and those machines transformed our world.
What Watt did was free us from being bound to build our manufacturing facilities next to waterways and let us put them anywhere. And it was with Watt's steam engines that commerce across the country was propagated.
Watt's invention fed the fires of the Industrial Revolution, a century and a half of breakneck growth. In the 20 years from 1780 to 1800 alone, the world's industrial output doubled, forever altering the lives of millions of people.
It ripped them out of their life in the village and created the working day, for a start. The notion that really work ought to be designed to accommodate itself to machines rather than to a kind of human tempo all happens with the Industrial Revolution.
Watt's invention and the revolution it spawned meant progress, but progress came at a heavy price for those who labored long hours in crowded and unsafe workplaces. For better or worse, James Watt propelled the Western world from a rural society to an industrial one. And modern life, you might even say he invented it. Cars, planes, phones, faxes, pollution, urban transit, the houses we live in, the stress we feel, every single mass-produced thing we buy. James Watt's invention set off the chain of events that created them all. Even his name has become a household word.
Watt really powered the Industrial Revolution with that steam engine, and it's very fitting that we label units of power as watts.
He was the son of a blacksmith, but Michael Faraday laid the foundation for the age of electricity. It all began with this primitive motor.
I think with some magnets and some, a wheel and a couple of wires, and the thing would simply turn as long as you applied current to it.
Now electricity does the chores for the farmer's wife.
Faraday also figured out how to send electric power over distance via the generator and the transformer. Without him, we'd have no electric appliances, no mixers or toasters. And here's a frightening thought: no television. Number 20 was a contemporary of George Washington. He was an absent-minded man who frequently mumbled to himself. But Scottish writer Adam Smith would redefine the way we think about money. In 1776, the year of the American Revolution, Smith set off another kind of revolution when he published The Wealth of Nations. This pioneering book spelled out for the very first time how the world's economy works. Distribution of wealth, division of labor. Smith was so insightful, within a few decades, every other school of economic thought had been all but abandoned. His biggest contribution may have been separating economics from politics. He said that government should keep its hands off business. He called this theory laissez-faire, French for let it alone.
It's the idea that an economy will organize itself, that you really produce a better outcome for almost everybody by letting people look to their own self-interest. So, for example, if you go into a city, it looks as if nobody's in charge, but lo and behold, you go into a butcher store and there's meat there. You go into a bank and you can get money. And it's been organized by Adam Smith's invisible hand.
Adam Smith's legacy was the theory of free trade. It was a novel concept then. Now it's part of our lives. That's why, to this day, Smith's name is synonymous with capitalism.
This list of the most important people in the millennium means the most important of those who are known. It's mainly white males with a few token women and people of color. we are probably going to have to spend the next millennium discovering what the real history of this millennium was.
Hello? Would you please get off this line?
Cat speaking. Hello, Daily Planet?
At the sound of the tone, the time will be exactly 12:05, please. Number, please. Information. Oh, golly.
Please hold for number 44 on our list, the illustrious Alexander Graham Bell.
He was starting out trying to figure out how to send more than one telegraph signal through the same wire. When he realized that he could send sound or voice through this thing, he got very excited because I think he believed he could help his deaf wife.
Bell invented the telephone in 1876. At first, it was regarded as little more than a novelty. But in just 4 years, there were nearly 250,000 worldwide. And that was just the beginning.
Most business today is done over the telephone, and if you add to the telephone internet and radio and television that's now being digitized and sent over phone lines, Alexander Graham Bell is controlling 99% of all of our communications in this day and age.
The Johnson Wax Program with Fibber McGee and Molly.
It's said that when our number 84, Guglielmo Marconi, was en route to Britain at the turn of the century, he was stopped at customs. Officials thought his black boxes were bombs. They had them destroyed. The devices young Marconi carried were explosive, but not the way the officers imagined. They were an invention that would change the way the world communicates: radio. At the age of 21, Marconi figured out how to send a message through the air without wires. And within a short time, he was transmitting all the way across the Atlantic.
The invention of radio essentially removed us from the shackles of wires and connections. It creates radio and television. It creates cellular telephony.
Since its invention, wireless has saved numberless ships and human lives from ocean disaster.
One poignant example, the Titanic. When the great ship went down, distress calls were sent out. Of course, many died, but over 700 survived, thanks to Marconi and his invention.
These rugged little tin Lizzies were made to order for an America itching to get up and go.
Henry Ford put America on wheels. He didn't just popularize the automobile, he created the assembly line and put America's industrial revolution into overdrive. Between 1908 and 1927, Ford's Michigan factories turned out 15 million Model Ts, a simple car famous for being available in any color as long as it was black.
He had a whole bunch of guys and pieces of the car moving along the production line. You could make cars very, very quickly that way.
Very quickly, and cheaper by the dozen. Ford's booming sales built one of the greatest industrial empires in the world. He controlled everything needed to build his cars, from the rubber plantations for tires to the mills that made the steel bodies. And in just 20 years, the automobile helped transform a land of rural isolation into a nation on the move.
I love to watch the TV game shows today. What is the big prize? Always. It's a car. Okay? It's the American dream. It is the fulfillment of a piece of the American dream made possible by Henry Ford.
In the past century, life expectancy in much of the world has doubled. In large part, we can thank one man, Louis Pasteur. Few scientists were more celebrated than this French biochemist, and few have had a more lasting impact.
Somebody like Pasteur, his contribution is incalculable. I mean, it is unquantifiable in numbers and genius, and certainly in the field of medicine, he's the man, as far as I'm concerned.
In the 1850s, Pasteur made a breakthrough discovery. Life is a germ. His work with yeast, the microbes that ferment wine and beer, opened a universe of discovery. Investigating those tiny organisms led him to study other bacteria, the ones that soured beverages like milk. He found that heating liquid for a short time killed the germs, a process that to this day bears his name, pasteurization.
Before Louis Pasteur, first of all, everybody thought that things happened by magic. You put certain things together and you got beer and you got bubbles and fermentation. Nobody understood that it was caused by bacteria. And so he took the mythology out of a lot of things that were part of everyday life and made it clear to people that there was a scientific explanation for this.
Pasteur speculated that if bacteria could attack food and drink, why not living organisms like us? He had already lost 3 daughters to disease, and he was driven to find out why. Pasteur theorized that if he could isolate the bacteria that caused a disease and inject a patient with a weakened form, it would inoculate against attacks from the real thing. His theory was very controversial, but Pasteur forged ahead, creating a vaccine to kill rabies and laying the groundwork for controlling such killers as typhoid fever and polio. Today, his mission is carried on at the Pasteur Institute he created, where Nobel Prize-winning scientists have fought malaria, tuberculosis, and AIDS. And Pasteur's legacy lives on, for he championed an idea we still use today, that hand washing can remove germs. Number 53 on our list is considered the greatest woman scientist in history, Madame Marie Curie. Together, she and her husband, Pierre, would lay the groundwork for the study of radiation.
She was a very special lady. She was the first to isolate a radioactive element, and then she discovered radium. And that was a profound contribution.
The discovery of these new elements led to the 1903 Nobel Prize for Physics for Pierre and Marie, the first time the award had ever been won by a woman. Over the past century, the use of X-rays and nuclear medicine has saved hundreds of thousands of lives. Tragically, Curie's discovery would lead to her death. She died of leukemia brought on by overexposure to radiation. Today, her notebooks remain under lock and key, still lethally radioactive.
They all laughed, Wilbur and his brother, when they said that man could fly.
Of course they laughed. Flying was the stuff of dreams, lovely to contemplate, impossible to achieve. But Wilbur and Orville Wright, number 40 on our list, ignored the laughter. For more than a decade, these two bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio, worked to build a flying machine. They conducted thousands of experiments with gliders, designing just the right wing and propeller. There were lots of failures, but on December 17, 1903, at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, Orville Wright flew their propeller-driven craft 120 feet. It was the first of 4 flights that day and the beginning of a brand new era.
They challenged themselves and pushed themselves to the limit. For all their perseverance, we've now got people being able to fly around the world in less than 30 hours.
The Wrights' invention not only revolutionized transportation, it answered an age-old yearning.
Man has always regretted being earthbound and has wanted to fly and wanted to soar and wanted to be weightless and wanted to explore. And the Wright brothers certainly made probably the greatest contribution to the entire 20th century by putting us there.
Who's got the last laugh now?
Mary had a little lamb, its street was white as snow.
There was a time in the early 19th century when experts suggested the U.S. government should shut down its patent office. There was nothing left to invent, or so they thought. Then along came number 14 on our list, the Wizard of Menlo Park, Thomas Edison.
Well, Thomas Edison invented an enormous number of things, more so than even somebody like Bell. Edison had a diversity of interests. He looked at problems and saw solutions.
We learned several things from Edison. One of them is that if you don't have to sleep, it helps because you can get a lot more work done, and he didn't seem to sleep very much, if at all. Second, the man's persistence paid off. He managed to try every possible thing out, and then he documented it all and filed it away in the patent office. Such discipline.
While Edison had only 3 months of formal education, he would be granted more patents than any person in American history. 1,093. They include the phonograph, the stock ticker, and the alkaline storage battery. But one invention was his greatest of all. On New Year's Eve, 1879, Edison flipped a switch and everything changed. The electric light gave us illumination around the clock. It gave us more hours in the day, more time to read, work, and play. Edison would go on to develop the electrical system that would power his masterpiece of tungsten and glass. And that was just the beginning. In 1888, he invented the kinetoscope, the first motion picture machine. He added sound in 1913 and gave birth to an industry.
The first motion picture studio ever set up in the world was in the yard of my laboratory at West Orange.
The thing that I guess I'm most grateful for Thomas Edison for is the invention of the motion picture. Light and shadow and projecting against a wall, and you can go back and say, well, the electric light bulb was the greatest thing he ever invented, and of course without that there would be an industry for motion picture production, but you know, he really made the first American movies, and I think all of us kind of look at him in this industry with a great deal of gratitude.
Edison's creativity and productivity gave rise to businesses that at his death were worth more than $25 billion. That's equal to $300 billion today. You could say Edison had the most valuable brain in history. But despite his tremendous success, Edison was a man of the people. He never tired of trading wisecracks with reporters.
How does it feel to be 84 years old?
Well, I have a little trouble now and then, and that's because I'm getting old. But I've got a lot of ginger yet.
Edison lit up the world. When he died in 1931, electric lights across America were dimmed in his honor. He trained to be a doctor, but couldn't stand watching surgery. He studied to be a clergyman, but that didn't work out either. Instead, he ended up shocking the world with an idea, an hypothesis of where we all come from. Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution.
In spite of my formal training in physics and my love of Galileo and Copernicus, I might just put Charles Darwin a notch above each of them. Because the Darwinian evolution affects human beings and the knowledge of where we came from much more directly than Galileo or even Copernicus or Einstein.
It was a discovery that almost didn't happen. When the British Royal Navy planned a scientific expedition, Darwin was offered a position as naturalist. His father didn't want him to go. The captain wasn't eager to have him along either. But at the last minute, Darwin went aboard. As the HMS Beagle traveled down the coast of South America, the young man marveled at the incredible variety of plants and animals he saw.
Here was an individual who fundamentally looked at the world. He didn't have elaborate instrumentation. He wasn't looking out at the stars. He wasn't looking with a microscope into the cell. He was just looking.
It was while observing the birds of the Galapagos Islands that Darwin made his most famous discovery. He counted 13 different types of finch on separate islands, some with long beaks, some with short ones, all sorts of variations. He wondered if nature had, over generations, adjusted the finches in varying ways to cope with their surroundings.
He began to come up with the idea of natural selection, that species tend to perish
if they're not well adapted to their environment, and they tend to thrive and reproduce if they are.
It was, Darwin reasoned, the survival of the fittest, or the swiftest, the one with the longest neck or sharpest beak. Over thousands and thousands of years, that was the way species evolved. Darwin kept researching until he was 50. In 1859, he finally published Origin of Species, which laid out his theory of evolution. The book sold out in a day, and the controversy began. In 19th century Victorian England, the book of Genesis was gospel, and the gospel said that God created Earth's creatures. Evolution seemed to fly right in the face of the Bible. The commotion would only grow louder when Darwin announced that the human species was a product of the evolutionary process too. That man was descended from apes and monkeys was an almost unthinkable notion in Darwin's day.
The concept of the thought of evolving from some substandard creature, or what you think to be substandard, is almost an insult to people. And, you know, a lot of people don't want to hear that. And sorry, but that's the way it is.
Today, Darwin's ideas are widely accepted, and yet they remain controversial. For they permanently dethroned man from his central place in the history of the Earth. He invented the science of genetics, an Austrian monk named Gregor Mendel, number 42 of the Millennium 100. Mendel patiently cultivated thousands of pea plants, studying how characteristics like height, shape, and color were passed from one generation to the next.
This was an absolutely fascinating discovery of heredity, the beginning of the understanding of genetics.
The first thing that he brought to light was the fact that there are what he called dominant traits and recessive traits.
Today, we grow closer to understanding how every gene works, how each may be altered or copied to fight disease or even to duplicate life itself. Humble Brother Mendel's discovery that each living thing inherits traits from the generations that preceded it was the first step. Banned in America, reviled in Ireland, but James Joyce, number 86 on our list, revolutionized modern literature. Joyce left his Irish birthplace early on for a life of European exile. Over the coming years, his writing would get more experimental, more radical. His masterpieces, Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, are novels of such confounding language and style, experts are still struggling to decode them.
I think that many people talk a great deal about James Joyce who've hardly managed to make their way through Ulysses and who, probably like me, have never read Finnegan's Wake. So he is more of a symbol, an icon, a national hero. He made difficulty fashionable.
Joyce's novels shocked the public with their frank sexuality and wild mix of random thoughts and pure emotion. Literature hasn't been the same since.
You see, Margaret Sanger, without her, I couldn't be Dr. Ruth Westheimer. She was a wonderful, courageous woman who really influenced work on that contraceptive pill, which certainly has changed the entire world.
Margaret Sanger, number 50 on our list, worked as a nurse in the slums of New York City. She was appalled by what she saw. The misery of unwanted pregnancies, the lack of sex education for men and women.
Margaret Sanger understood that we couldn't really have freedom from the skin out until we had freedom from the skin in. That is, until women could control our own reproductive lives.
Birth control teaches parents to bring into the world children by choice rather than by chance.
As the world's population continues to grow, Sanger's work goes on through her Planned Parenthood Foundation.
history isn't made by a few people, it's made by a lot of people. But without thousands, millions of people acting with the courage of Stanton, we would still today be objects, not people.
Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the first lady of American feminism, number 56 on our list. She made her mark organizing the first women's rights convention at Seneca Falls, New York in 1848, for which she wrote a rousing manifesto.
That document came to the conclusion that women should not be excluded from those glorious words of the Declaration and the Constitution, and believed that they had those inalienable rights that men had.
Stanton soon joined forces with Susan B. Anthony. Together, they crusaded for women's causes. Stanton died in 1902, years before women were granted the right to vote, but with the knowledge that she had changed the relationship between men and women forever. It's a good thing that number 36, Alexander Fleming, was a messy guy. Otherwise, he probably wouldn't be on our Millennium list. Fleming's story begins in his London laboratory. One day in 1928, he noticed a strange fungus growing in a petri dish that seemed to kill the bacteria around it. He ran some tests, wrote up his notes, and put the mold aside.
Most of us would have looked and said, oh, and thrown it away. That's what would happen.
The substance was penicillin, and it would revolutionize medicine. Penicillin laid waste the germs that cause such deadly diseases as diphtheria, pneumonia, and syphilis.
I am old enough to have practiced medicine in the days before penicillin. I can tell you it was like night and day. People died of things that we would never think a patient would die of.
The discovery of penicillin came at a crucial moment. With the outbreak of World War II, it was hailed as the wonder drug. By the time D-Day arrived, there was enough penicillin to treat every wounded Allied soldier. Fleming received the Nobel Prize, a knighthood, and the knowledge that his work had saved millions of lives. He was banished from Germany, expelled from France and Belgium. He died without any idea that he had unleashed a movement that would sweep across the world. Karl Marx, champion of the underclass and the father of communism.
Karl Marx has trouble making it in the top 10, in my opinion, because his theories were consigned, to use a phrase of his, to the ash heap of history. A millennium from now, we'll have forgotten about him.
There's no doubt that Karl Marx, as a thinker, as a social analyst, is certainly among the most influential figures of the last century, whether you like it or not. The perversion of his thought led to millions and millions of deaths. But when you talk about importance, you're not talking only about milk and honey.
Karl Marx was a German scholar and editor. He barely earned enough to support his family, and 3 of his 6 children died in childhood. To him, the world was unjust and ruled by the capitalist upper class. Workers work, and the bosses get rich. Marx believed the working class would one day rise up to take their fair share. He hoped they would create a utopian society in which money would be equally divided and no one would be hungry or ignorant. In the mid-19th century, Marx's ideas were revolutionary. His 2 groundbreaking works were the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital, co-written with Friedrich Engels.
No one ever read his epic work, Das Kapital. It's unreadable and dense, and it's an economic theory which doesn't apply to the world today and barely applied when he wrote it. But he hit the mood that came after the revolutions of 1848 perfectly with his one phrase, "Workers of the world unite." There's something more important than what nation you're part of, and that is your class. Workers are being oppressed similarly everywhere. And this simple idea took hold, and the international movements were formed.
It would be nearly 70 years before Marx's theories actually took root, adapted by leaders like Vladimir Lenin in his 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. Communism spread across the Eastern Bloc from the newly formed Soviet Union, setting the stage for the most enduring conflict of the 20th century, the Cold War. At its peak, 1 billion people lived under communism, more than any other political system in history. But with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989 and the collapse of communist regimes throughout Europe, Marx's vision of a worldwide workers' revolution now seems at best a utopian ideal that went wrong, and at worst, an abject failure.
If you analyze the great revolutions, which were primarily Russia and China, a few others, you can see that they never were true Marxists. In the end, communism was a real dictatorship theory, not an economic theory, and it failed because the economic part of it was completely wrong.
Well, it's very easy to dismiss Marx wholesale because of the slaughter that took place in his name. His analysis of relations between workers and owners, his analysis of many things, was in fact very often a work of genius. Marx is part of us, whether we like it or not.
He led a world-shaking revolution and became the first ruler of the Soviet Union. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, Lenin, number 35 on our list. He took the theories of Marx and Engels and twisted them for his own use while secretly organizing opposition to the Tsar. As famine and poverty devastated Russia, Lenin organized the Bolshevik Party, and in November 1917, he led them to the barricades, and the revolution began.
It wasn't a true people uprising. The Bolsheviks were never the majority in Russia. It was a coup. It was a party-led coup by a brilliant political opportunist.
It was a surprisingly bloodless takeover, but the aftermath was not. Lenin was ruthless. Civil war, starvation, and the secret police killed millions.
What Lenin was about in the end was brutality and power. The first concentration camps were the creation of Lenins. The establishment of a war on intellectuals and free thought and religion was an invention not of Stalin's, but of Lenin's.
Lenin's dream was to spread the communist revolution around the world. He would succeed only in part. But the lives that were lost, the money that was wasted in 7 decades of East-West strife make Lenin's rise to power one of the pivotal events of the millennium. It was called the Little Red Book, Quotations of Chairman Mao Zedong, leader of the Chinese Communist Revolution.
He seized control of the largest country on earth, starting from a base of almost nothing. It took him over 20 years. He then transformed his country dramatically. He killed millions of people. He is right up there with Hitler and Stalin as one of the greatest murderers of the century.
Mao ruled China for 27 years, and though he lifted 1/5 of the world's people up from feudal deprivation, the nation he created remains one of the most repressive regimes of modern times. With the fall of the Soviet Union, China is now the world's reigning communist society. He was just one man, a soft-spoken man, yet he took on the mightiest empire on earth. And in a battle without guns or swords, he prevailed, leading his country to independence. Mahatma Gandhi, without question, one of the most remarkable leaders of the millennium.
I regard myself as a soldier, though a soldier of peace. It is complete independence that we want.
Mahatma means great soul, and no one deserved the title more than this deeply pious man. Gandhi, the son of a wealthy merchant family, studied in England to become a lawyer. On his return to India, he set out to use the British legal system against itself to gain freedom for his people. His weapon was non-violent civil disobedience.
We must remember that this has been the most brutal and the most violent century in terms of wars. We lived through 2 major wars. We've had all these conflicts around us, and then here comes up someone who says, you don't have to fight to win. And that with reason, with compassion, with determination, you can get your cause across. And I think that was a very powerful message.
Gandhi adopted the ways of the peasant class, eating little and making the thread for his clothes on a simple spinning wheel that's now a symbol on the flag of India. He fought for freedom from the British with an ingenious array of peaceful tactics, strikes and boycotts and mass arrests that clogged India's jails. A march to the sea protested a punishing tax on salt. When Gandhi reached an impasse, he would begin a fast, starving himself as a cleansing ritual, but also using the threat of his death to increase pressure on the British. His gentle defiance awoke the conscience of the world and signaled the beginning of the end of Britain's vast colonial empire. In 1947, Gandhi finally achieved his dream of freedom for India, but it came at a terrible price. Mob violence between warring Hindus and Muslims racked the new nation. And in January 1948, the simple man of peace was gunned down by a religious fanatic. Yet his life and his death sowed the seeds for a new generation of idealists.
Martin Luther King learned a lot from Gandhi's approach, Gandhi's struggle, using reason, his voice, his arguments, and reaching out to the people and giving them hope.
Perhaps the martyred men of principle will leave more of a legacy through their ideas than the men of power like Mao and Stalin, who rule with an iron fist, but they leave nothing behind. So in the end, it is the leaders of great principle that live on.
Sigmund Freud was a genius. You see, before Sigmund Freud, the question of talking about issues of sexuality was absolutely taboo.
Number 12 on our list is the father of psychoanalysis, the man who quite literally changed the way we think about ourselves, Dr. Sigmund Freud. Freud saw himself as a detective of the mind, looking for clues in the unconscious. He developed what has often been called the talking cure, a method of encouraging patients to say whatever came to mind. He believed that dreams, random thoughts, even jokes could reveal the fears and fantasies that ripple through our lives.
What he has given us is crucial. This genius of saying, don't take people just at their face value. Find out what their relationship was with their parents, with their siblings. Talk about jealousy. Talk about all of those emotions.
In his case studies, Freud looked into the depths of the human psyche. What he found there time and again were primal drives like sex and aggression.
Freud's view of women and inner space and outer space, and that your entire life is determined, frankly, by your womb or, or by your genitals, I find totally confounding. It's an idea that hit and changed the world and should definitely be on your list, whether I agree with it or not. Some days you go to therapy and think, oh, please, God, let this be true. I just hope this man knew what he was talking about and it's all fixable.
Today, when we talk about ourselves, we use Freud's words: ego, libido, Oedipus complex. For even now, it is Freud's map that guides us through the most secret world of all, the complicated landscape of the human mind.
If you were to read Freud now, you would look up and say, well, everybody knows this. But nobody knew it. Only he knew it.
So what we have to say today is thank you, Sigmund Freud, for being a pioneer and for helping people like myself to gain that knowledge about sexuality.
Pablo Picasso is the single greatest artist of the 20th century and the 19th and the 18th. And
Pablo Picasso, number 64. Prodigious painter, sculptor, potter, and artist. In his 91 years, he produced some 20,000 works in a mind-boggling variety of styles. And more than that, he changed all the rules.
I think he'll go down in history as another Leonardo. I mean, Leonardo had so many strings to his bow, and he was a scientist as well as an artist and a sculptor and a creator of new technologies and so on. And I think the same thing with Picasso. I mean, that he managed to transform the whole face of art.
Visionary, revolutionary, and chameleon, Picasso shattered conventions and fragmented space. And when he was done, he had redefined the face of both painting and sculpture. Art is not the truth, he said. It's a lie that allows us to approach the truth.
Most dramatic step to date in women's campaign for equal rights, women who register and vote.
They called her an anarchist. They called her a man-hater. But it's because of number 89, the sturdy Quaker named Susan B. Anthony, that women in the United States have the right to vote. In an 1872 election, she marched up to the ballot box and voted. She was immediately arrested and fined $100, which she refused to pay. Anthony became America's premier suffragette, focusing the country's attention on equal rights for women. Her struggle would win them the rights they cherish to this day.
We face the future with confidence and with courage. We are American.
When you look at American political leaders of the century, one person stands out so far above the others that it's not even close, and that's Franklin Roosevelt.
At age 39, he was struck down by polio. Yet his determination and compassion would guide our nation through two of its greatest crises. The only man ever elected president 4 times, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, number 60 on our list. In 1933, he set in motion the New Deal, massive programs to restore jobs and pull the country out of the Great Depression. And then his nation faced an even greater challenge, World War II.
We are going to win this war, and we are going to win the peace that follows.
Roosevelt led us through both the greatest war in history and the domestic crisis, and also left behind a legacy of ideas embodied in his greatest speeches, which live on to this day.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Number 82 is this man, Niels Bohr, master physicist, father of quantum theory, decoder of the atom's powerful secrets.
Bohr was the first one to understand how an atom is put together.
Bohr fled the Nazis during the war and brought his research with him, helping make the A-bomb a reality. For the rest of his life, Bohr devoted himself to obliterating the horror he helped create and waged a worldwide campaign for peace. The New Mexico desert, on a mid-July morning in 1945. Scientists are about to unleash a force unlike anything ever known. One blinding flash, and the world would never be the same. The atomic bomb was born, and the man described as its father, J. Robert Oppenheimer, would spend the rest of his life grappling with what he had done. Oppenheimer is number 88 on the Millennium 100. When World War II began, he was assigned to head the top-secret Manhattan Project as America raced to build the bomb.
Oppenheimer belongs on the list because he was the man who orchestrated it. He was the man. He was the director of the symphony orchestra. The orchestra played the symphony of fission, the symphony of making bombs.
On August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, Japan, killing more than 70,000 men, women, and children. The knowledge tortured Oppenheimer to his dying day.
I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
One of those scientists is this man, the father of the nuclear age, number 8 on our list, Albert Einstein.
Albert Einstein is to the modern era what Galileo was in the Renaissance. And that's why I put them very close together. Maybe Einstein just a notch above.
He couldn't speak fluently until he was 9. He was a mediocre student who cut classes and dropped out of high school. But by the age of 26, Einstein published his remarkable theory of relativity.
Separate, fission. I'm always fascinated by Einstein. I'm fascinated by that man. That my favorite picture of Einstein is the one where
He was a man of great simplicity, high informality. If he was the greatest scientist ever lived, I wouldn't dare to say, but he was certainly, if you want to name 5, I would count him in, of all times.
E stands for energy, M for mass, and c squared is the speed of light multiplied by itself. Now, c squared is a very great number. And so, if multiplied by even a small mass, the result will be a very great amount of energy.
In 1905, Einstein published his 3 seminal papers on light, gravity, and the laws of motion. The centerpiece was the theory of relativity, which laid down a mind-bending new definition of space and time.
When Einstein came up and said, you know something, when you travel faster, time slows down, mass increases. You could go away and come back and you'll be younger than your twin sister. You say, that doesn't make sense. You know something? It doesn't make sense to anybody, and it doesn't have to. You have to put on a different hat that abandons your common sense.
Commonsensical or not, the ramifications of Einstein's theories were stunning. They unlocked the infinite potential of the atom for both creation and total destruction. Einstein, a longtime pacifist, was afraid of what his work might inspire and appalled by the rise of a new leader in his native land, Adolf Hitler. Einstein left Germany for the United States in 1933. The Nazis gathered a group of scientists who attacked his theory and labeled it Jew science. If I were wrong, Einstein reportedly said, one professor would have been enough. In 1939, in a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt, Einstein urged watchfulness and, if necessary, quick action to beat Germany to the atomic bomb. FDR secretly set up a team to develop atomic weapons, a team without Einstein.
He was totally uninvolved in the development of the bomb. He did not even know what was happening. When he heard after Hiroshima what had happened, he said, "Oy vey," which means, oh my God. And he was shocked.
The nuclear age had begun, and Einstein was deeply concerned about where it would lead.
It was a weird thing. He knew that this was Pandora's molecule, the manifestation of what we've been living under the fear of for the last 50 years. We're still living with the fact of who has a nuclear bomb.
In his later years, Einstein worked for international peace and the creation of a Jewish state. In fact, he was offered the presidency of Israel in 1952. He declined the honor, yet famed playwright George Bernard Shaw still gave him sovereignty over the entire universe.
Ptolemy made a universe which lasted 1,400 years.
Newton also made a universe which has lasted 300 years. Einstein has made a universe, and I can't tell you how long that will last.
Stalin was a psychopath in power, with an enormous army, with absolute control of information in people's minds in a way that to us is unimaginable.
He started out studying for the priesthood, but he became one of the most merciless dictators in the world. The blood of some 30 million people is on his hands. Joseph Stalin, premier of the Soviet Union.
He was a maniac who committed heinous acts, wiped out generations of intellectuals and clergy.
Stalin crushed his country, then recast it as an industrial giant. When World War II ended, he provoked the Cold War that would consume the planet for the next 45 years.
The damage that Stalin wrought, and the damage that he set in place even after his death, will continue to haunt the Soviet Union and now Russia for decades to come.
Und damit ein Symbol des Ewigen. Es lebe die nationalsozialistische Bewegung. Es lebe Deutschland.
It is one of the ironies of our list that a saintly man like Mahatma Gandhi should be followed by the madman of the millennium, Adolf Hitler, number 16.
Hitler was a maniac and a killer, but he transformed his century in an absolutely fundamental way. He overthrew practically the entire European system. He is responsible for the decline of Europe as the center of world events.
He was the demon seed of a Germany reeling from defeat in World War I. Adolf Hitler rose from the gutter to become the most ruthless dictator in history. He was charismatic and clever, expert at both strong-arm tactics and subtle political maneuvering. But it was his skillful use of propaganda that propelled Hitler to power.
Ein Volk, ein Führer, ein Reich, Deutschland.
Most Germans are embarrassed that he ever existed, find no explanation how it was possible that an Austrian who never held a job in his life becomes unquestioned ruler of Germany. It is an aberration. It is a madman who got hold of a government.
The amazing thing was how close this man came to world domination. It would take an unparalleled alliance of powers to turn the tide of World War II. But not before Hitler had wreaked a horror that chills us still. Never before had someone tried so consciously and systematically to wipe an entire race off the face of the earth.
He committed unspeakable crimes for no purpose except to serve his own prejudices. Why people were killed in the gas chambers, for that there's no realistic explanation. One doesn't even know why he hated the Jews so much.
You can make a very strong case, and I say this with the greatest reluctance, that the most influential person in the century that's now drawing to a close has been the most evil person the century produced. What Adolf Hitler did can never be erased. 50 million people died because of him. The worst kind of Holocaust was perpetrated on the Jewish people and many other peoples. And the legacy of it lives on even today in places like Bosnia and Kosovo and other parts of the world.
What kind of a people do they think we are? Is it possible they do not realize that we shall never cease to persevere against them until they have been taught a lesson which they and the world will never forget?
The difference between great and ordinary statesmen is not intelligence, but vision and courage.
The invincible Sir Winston Churchill, In a life that spanned 9 decades, Sir Winston saw it all. Everything from the cavalry charge to thermonuclear weapons. And when World War II erupted, the British turned to Churchill for leadership.
Churchill's combination of sheer courage, relentless energy, and the fact that he was a military man who knew an immense amount about the art of war enabled Britain to survive at a point when I think any other leader would have given in.
Miraculously, Britain held under the bulldog leadership of Winston Churchill.
It is difficult to imagine any of the available leaders who could have rallied Britain in 1940 the way Churchill did.
Lift up your heart. All will come right out of the depths of sorrow and of sacrifice. Will be born again the glory of mankind.
He was a 19th century romantic at a time when that kind of heroic approach worked well in the world. I don't know if it would work today. This is not a time of great heroes, but Churchill believed in heroes, and he consciously set out in that mold, and it was an extraordinary achievement.
I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the voice of America's civil rights movement. He preached a doctrine of nonviolent protest in the face of segregationist brutality and revealed to the world the injustice of racial discrimination. His words inspired both blacks and whites to join the struggle for a more just society.
He's someone who encouraged them to dream and to reach out. He's someone who got across to them that you don't have to feel inferior. You don't have to accept discrimination.
The grace of Dr. King's vision was best expressed on an August day in 1963, the March on Washington.
When all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
King would die a martyr to his cause in 1968, gunned down by an assassin.
Martin Luther King's ideals live on in America. The ideal that we are bound together, and if we work together, we can have the hope. The glory is in the striving. And so I think that that's the legacy that lives on, is the legacy of hope.
Mandela insisted on walking so people could see him. The silver-haired black leader with his wife at his side waved to the huge crowd.
It was one of the most thrilling events of the decade, a February day in 1990 when Nelson Mandela was freed. Mandela had been imprisoned for 27 years. His crime, opposition to South Africa's vicious system of apartheid. Racial segregation at the point of a gun. Even in solitary confinement, Mandela's voice was heard, and worldwide opinion rallied to his cause. When they freed Mandela, they freed his country. In South Africa's first democratic election, blacks and whites came together to elect him president. His first act was to open his arms to those who had imprisoned him.
I think the message, he was in jail for 27 years. He came out without bitterness, open and prepared to work with those who locked him up. And given what is happening on the African continent, you ask yourself, why can't they learn from him? Why can't they get his message?
The scientists who unlocked the secret of life and unraveled the structure of DNA are James Watson and Francis Crick. They identified the DNA molecule that contains all the genetic information in animal and human cells. Their findings won them the Nobel Prize in 1962. Scientists are now deciphering the entire human genetic structure, figuring out which genes create eye and hair color, personality traits, susceptibility to disease. Watson and Crick's discovery has led to genetic engineering, from miracle cures to clones like Dolly the sheep.
Mikhail Gorbachev was learning the hard lesson of democracy today, that giving people freedom means they are free to turn against you.
He's the founding father of Glasnost and the last leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev.
What I find fascinating about Gorbachev is that he was a good human being who brought about results that he didn't really want. Gorbachev wanted to reform the communist system, and he wanted to modernize the communist system. He didn't want to overthrow the communist system.
When Gorbachev took power in 1985, he set out to preserve communism by reshaping the crippled Soviet economy. But then everything changed.
And once he opened up the prison doors of the communist society and said, let's have glasnost, you couldn't give people 50% freedom. His importance is undeniable, but the impact of what he did was not what he intended.
History will note that he did a lot intentionally. His role is as a catalyst for the most important event of century's end, and that was the dismantling, almost bloodlessly, of what Ronald Reagan called the evil empire.
People are trying to do more and more with their personal computers. They're reaching out and viewing it as a critical communications tool.
There are less than a dozen living members on our list, and this man is the youngest of them all. Bill Gates, college dropout, chairman and CEO of Microsoft, and the man who transformed the computer industry. His software products are installed in more than 90% of all personal computers worldwide.
Think about electricity or water or the phone system just being there. You take all of that for granted. Computers will be the same way.
Less than 20 years ago, Bill Gates' company was hired to design the operating system for IBM's first personal computers. Gates' program, MS-DOS, soon became the standard for the entire PC industry.
Bill found a place in history to fill, and then because of his character, managed to fill it extremely well.
And he's also damned lucky that IBM didn't understand the value of what it was he was doing.
From Word to Windows, Gates' software has helped spark the most radical revolution in communications and information since the printing press.